So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us here on this virtual format for the first of our final two presentations of 2020. A couple quick announcements before we introduce today's speaker. Support for these programs have been made possible by the Nancy Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation in Sage Creek Ranch. These sponsors really help make everything we do possible. And we're also grateful to you, our audience, for your feedback and support for programs like the Lunchtime Expedition Program. We are recording these lectures and uploading them to our YouTube channel, the Draper YouTube channel. So if you've missed any of our previous speakers, you can find their talks along with speakers from previous years there. If you'd like to be added to our listserv for upcoming announcements and lectures, please just send me an email at courier@centerofthewest.org. There will be that email address will be up on the screen at the end of today's lecture. We're also including links to previous talks in these emails, so another good reason to sign up. We're broadcasting today's presentation over Zoom webinar and Facebook Live. As I mentioned before, feel free to submit your questions below using Zoom's chat feature or Q&A feature on the Facebook Live or on Facebook Live, and we will relay your questions to our speaker at the end of the presentation. Today, I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lawrence Haney. Dr. Haney developed his twin interests in the biology of mammals and the evolution of biological diversity on islands at an early age, while working as a volunteer and assistant in the Division of Mammals at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History. His project in the Philippines since 1981, conducted in collaboration with museums, universities, conservation organizations, and government agencies, has contributed substantially to the establishment of dozens of national parks and to the founding of the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. In addition to his position with the Field Museum, Haney teaches and advises students at the University of Chicago and the University of the Philippines, and is a research fellow at the Philippine National Museum of Natural History. Without further ado, please welcome today's speaker, Dr. Haney. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, I'm delighted to be joining you today. I wanted to mention that I've gotten to know Corey over the course of the last couple of years, and he invited me out, my wife and myself, to visit the museum there in Cody last year, and we had a wonderful time. Fantastic exhibits, really a great program. That area has particular meaning for me and had a big impact on my development of interest in biology. When I was 6 years old, the family visited Yellowstone, and it was the first time that I saw bison or moose or grizzlies. Well, I'm not sure what else we saw, but boy, it sure had a big impact on me. Well, I get back every couple of years, spend a week or so just enjoying that magnificent scenery and the wonderful wildlife. So, fantastic place. I'm envious of all of you who live in that area. But my interest in biology had developed geographically rather differently. As Corey mentioned, I'm principally at this point, and have been for some time, interested in biological diversity on tropical islands. This is something that I'm sure many of you are aware. There are a lot of concerns about what's been going on with deforestation, with introduction of exotic species, with, well, all sorts of political problems. I'm going to talk about some of those things today. But first, I want to talk about just the wonderful fauna that's there, and how it developed to be what we see today, and some about how we learn about this fauna. It is, in many respects, a world apart. It is very, very different from the situation that those of us who live in continental areas are accustomed to thinking about. Many of the things that you may hear may surprise you somewhat, some in positive ways, some negative. Hope you find it all to be interesting. So I am going to begin scrolling through this, and Corey or Nathan, let me know if you see any problems. So I want to begin by mentioning first that this is a long-term project, and it's been very much of a collaborative project. So this is not, by any means my own work. It's something that I've done working with people in the US and very widely in the Philippines. I don't have time to list all of them, but I want you to get the sense of what some of this looks like, the breadth of the organizations that have been involved in this. I've been really fortunate to have a lot of really wonderful colleagues. It's been a big part of what's made this both productive and enjoyable. Okay, so here is the acknowledgement slide. Lots of folks have been involved in this, and that's a big part of what's made it a great project to be involved with. Okay, so I'm going to start by making a few comparisons about the Philippine fauna, just to give you a sense of how it compares. So in 1990, I and some other folks compiled information about the native land living animals in the Philippines, vertebrates in particular. So at the time, among land-living native mammals, we knew of 182 species. 65% of those live nowhere else in the world. That includes bats, which disperse pretty well. So I'll show you some figures in a little bit. Among the non-flying mammals, the percent of the species that occur nowhere else in the world that are endemic to the Philippines is, by anybody's measure, extremely high. Among the breeding land birds, so not including gulls and shearwaters and other things that are not regularly resident on the land, 395 species at the time, and even among the birds, 44% that occur nowhere else in the world. At the time, we knew about 258 species of reptiles, so lizards and snakes, 65% nowhere else. Amphibians, 101 species, 77% that occur nowhere else in the world. So at the time, we knew of well over 900 native species in the Philippines. So things that are native there, that belong there, that got there on their own. And of those, 57% overall occur nowhere else in the world. Okay, so those are big numbers. In order to put that into some context, we can compare it to Spain, which is the country in Europe that has the largest number of vertebrate species. At the time, we knew of, and it hasn't changed very much, 435 species. 25 of them, or 6%, are endemic to Spain. That's pretty typical for most countries globally. Well, all right, so what about the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, which of course is one of the great natural storehouses of biological diversity? Well over 3,000 species known at the time. Of course, that number has continued to rise. 25% of them occur nowhere else in the world. That 788 species, of course, is well over the 537 that we knew of in the Philippines. Brazil is 28 times larger. On a per unit area basis, so far as we know at this point, the Philippines has the greatest concentration per square mile of any country in the world. That's why I work in the Philippines. I want to know why. So a little bit of geographic orientation here. Here's a standard political map showing the location of the Philippines in Southeast Asia. You can see that it lies, more or less to the east of Vietnam, a little bit further to the south, and it lies off the northern end of the big island in the center there. That's Borneo, which is politically part of Malaysia and Indonesia. The Philippines lies immediately to the north of Sulawesi, which is also known as Celebes. I'll refer to that island. That's the one with the long skinny arms. I'll refer to that a couple of times in a little bit. And you can see down at the bottom right of the image there of the map, a portion of Australia. So all of this area is really sandwiched between Australia and the mainland of Asia. Now, this is a political map, which of course is important, but biologically it's a lot less meaningful than other maps that we could look at. So one of the key features in thinking about this part of the world is recognizing that, well, here in Chicago, from 12,000 years ago back to about 20,000 years ago, there was a mile of ice covering Chicago. In the same way that there were glaciers up in the high plateau country of Yellowstone, this entire part of the continent here in the upper Midwest was glaciated. The water that made up those glaciers had evaporated principally from the world's oceans and been deposited on land. Now there are natural cycles in the Earth's climate. So there is natural climatic variability. That natural variability operates on about a 100,000 year cycle. So it fluctuates from times when it's relatively cool and relatively warm. Without going into all the details, during the relatively cool times, much of the water that falls in the high elevation and northern areas comes down as snow. And if the summers are not warm enough to melt all of the snow that falls, of course, it builds up over the years. And over thousands of years, you end up producing glaciers. So we had huge glaciers over much of the northern hemisphere, in a few places in the southern hemisphere. As the water evaporated from the oceans and was deposited on land and stayed as ice, sea level, of course, necessarily went down. So at the height of the glacial maximum on land, sea level was about 120 meters, so about 400 feet lower than it is today. 400 feet lower. So this map shows what Southeast Asia looked like during that period of time. So what you can see is that extending down from the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, so Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, that area, through the Malay Peninsula and extending out to Sumatra, Borneo, and Java, was a very broad plain, relatively flat area that today is covered by seawater. So all of the areas that are shown in kind of that medium tone of gray rather than the light gray, the darker shade of gray, that was all dry land. This was exposed as dry land long enough that in fact river valleys developed. And using sonar today, you could look down 120 meters below you from a boat at the bottom of the ocean, and there are river channels that you can still see. It's really cool. Okay, so with respect to the Philippines, what matters here is that if you look at this map, you can see that although there are a series of kind of stepping stone islands going out toward the main body of the Philippines, there are sea channels that remained continuously as seawater throughout these periods of low sea level. And even within the Philippines, not all of the islands were connected together. So here's a map that shows the Philippines during the late Pleistocene, the last of the most recent of the ice ages, when sea level was about 120 meters, 400 feet lower than at present. So the modern islands are shown in dark green. Areas that remained as ocean as seas, shown in blue, and the light green are the areas that are now covered by seawater, but were exposed as dry land at the time. So let's see if I can, yes, I can use my cursor. I hope you're able to see that. So here's Luzon Island up here. Manila Bay is this right here. All right, so if you look at Luzon Island, which I'm going to be talking about quite a bit, you can see that it's separated from this nearby island of Mindoro by a deep sea channel right in through here that never went dry. There's another deep sea channel right down here between the southern tip of Luzon and the northern tip of what at the time was a single large island referred to as Greater Mindanao. Mindanao is the name of the big island down here that we use currently. Leyte Island is right here. This one is Samar. Then there was another big island out here that formed from 4 pretty big islands and some smaller ones that merged together during this period of low sea level. Some of the islands like Sibuyan, for example, out here that are small islands, is continuously separated or was continuously separated by areas that continue to be very deep seawater. Other islands scattered around the country, some of them remained isolated, others like this one, these down here, merged into larger islands. So that's a pretty profound change in the geography of the Philippines. One of the first things that we realized looking at the geography of mammal distributions was that this really has an enormous impact on distribution patterns overall. So I'm going to, I would love to spend time talking about bats. I love bats. Here are some drawings of what some of these Philippine bats, representatives of what they look like. Fantastic animals. I don't have time to talk about everything that I'd like to talk about today. So I'm barely going to mention bats again. But you know, there are somewhere between 80 and 100 species of bats in the Philippines, and they range from tiny things with wingspans about 4, I'd say 5 inches, to others that have wingspans of up to 5 feet. Instead, I'm going to be talking about non-flying mammals, non-volant mammals. So all of the mammals that are native that don't fly. Okay, so if we look at the map here, here's that late Pleistocene Ice Age island of Greater Luzon. 56 species of native non-flying mammals. 52 of the 56 occur nowhere else in the world, not even elsewhere in the Philippines. 93% occur nowhere else in the world. Smaller islands often have many native endemic species as well. So here on Mindoro, 12 of the 16 occur nowhere else in the world. Even on adjacent parts of Luzon. Yeah, there are 4 of them that do occur in both of these areas, but you know, that's not very many. Sibuyan Island, this little island out here, 55% of the 9 species occur nowhere else in the world. There are 5 species there that occur nowhere else. So how do we put that into context? There are no countries in continental Europe that have 5 endemic species of mammals. Sibuyan, this little island that hardly anybody even in the Philippines has ever heard of, has 5 endemic species of mammals. Palawan over here, 80% of the species, nowhere else. Greater Mindanao, big island in the south, 93% of the ones we know of right now. It's not as well known as some of the other parts of the Philippines. I may have time to talk a little bit about that too. Okay, so the reason why the Philippines is a remarkable global center of mammalian diversity and particularly endemic diversity is that it's actually not a single homogeneous area. It's many different sets of islands that within themselves share species, but share very, very few between them. And the reason is this deep history that goes back well into the ice ages, where sea level apparently allowed animals that occurred throughout, for example, Greater Mindanao to move fairly widely within this area, but not to cross even that narrow channel here. That channel during the ice ages was probably less than 10 miles wide. In some places, it may have only been 5 miles wide. And yet that was clearly that was enough to prevent these animals from moving between islands. Okay, so how do we get that information? Where does it all come from? This is one of the best parts of doing this kind of research. I love doing the field work, working with folks over there. Typically what's involved is, for me, is to get on an airplane in Chicago, fly to Manila, gather up my collaborators from the universities and the conservation NGOs and the museums and so on, and head into the hills. When we get out there, hire a bunch of local people to work as camp helpers and particularly as porters. Everything that we take with us into the field has to be carried on someone's back. There is no other way. Once we get to the base of the mountain, there is no other way to get the material moved around. So we'll use trucks and water buffalo and boats and so on wherever we can. But at some point, we start walking. We establish field camps. This is a pretty large and nice one. Just to give you some idea of what things are like, here is our laboratory, our very modern laboratory. Over here is the dining room and kitchen, our laundry facilities here, and of course a couple of there were probably 6 or 8 tents scattered around nearby where we live. It's a pretty basic way to live, but if you're enjoying the work, the fact that you eat rice and dried fish most of the time doesn't really matter much. Because it allows us to work with animals that, well, some of them look like this. So when Corey looked at this, his question to me was, what kind of primate is that thing? It's not a primate. This is a bushy-tailed giant cloud rat. To a taxonomist, this is a rat. It doesn't look like a rat. It doesn't eat stuff like a rat. They live up in the treetops and they eat tender young buds and young leaves and bamboo shoots. They smell good. They don't carry disease. They're wonderful animals. And yet, to a taxonomist, this is a rat. So this group of cloud rats, I'll use as an example. There, we know of 18 or so living species today. They are in 5 different genera. So a genus is the group of, the category above species. So as an example, the genus Canis includes wolves, coyotes, jackals, a variety of other, kind of dog-like animals, well, and domestic dogs as well. So it's a group of related species. So we've got 5 genera of cloud rats that occur in the Philippines. And the majority of them occur only on Luzon. So here are the bushy-tailed giant cloud rats. They weigh, about 1.5 kilos, so about 2.5 to 3 pounds. These are even bigger. There are 2 species in this genus. They weigh up to about 6 pounds, so they're about the size of a small house cat. There are a couple of others that are about the size of fairly good sized ground squirrel. And then the 5th one, if you can pick it out, is right there. So they became known in English as giant cloud rats. These 2, this one and this one, were the first ones to be known. So the name giant cloud rat often is applied to the group. These guys, when they were discovered, came to be referred to as dwarf cloud rats, or sometimes dwarf giant cloud rats. So this apparently should be referred to as a micro dwarf giant cloud rat, or something to that effect. Okay, another group. that occurs, again, another branch on the tree of life that lives only in the Philippines. Most of the species are on Luzon Island. We refer to these as earthworm mice. The reason is that, well, okay, I'll tell you, I'm going to try to not get too distracted by telling stories that are somewhat peripheral, but I got to tell a few of them. So when we started working in the Philippines, there was virtually nothing known about the species that were known at the time of any of these small mammals, other than the fact that, you know, there were certain ones that were known to exist. We didn't know what they ate. We would know that they were captured, you know, for example, on some given mountain, but we didn't know what kind of habitat they were in, whether they were up at the top of the mountain or at the bottom of the mountain. We just knew that they were there. And sometimes we knew that they had very strange anatomy. So an example of that are these rincomines. We now often refer to these as Tweezer beaked hopping rats. They have extremely long, narrow snouts. And we could tell from the specimens, the 2 specimens in museums, that they had big hind legs and fairly good sized feet. You know, kind of looked a little bit like a small, maybe kangaroo rat or something like that. No idea what they fed on. So we went to the place where one of the species had been found 40 years before, knowing that they were somewhere on the mountain. So we started at the bottom of the mountain, wanting to look for them and whatever else was there, and did standardized transect, setting traps, standardized number at the bottom of the mountain, moved up 200 meters in elevation, did another standardized sampling, up another 200 meters, and so on, doing standardized trapping from the base of the mountain to the top of the mountain. And that's pretty much the procedure that we've followed ever since then. This was in 1988 that we did this. So after working on that mountain for about a month with a very active, hardworking group of people, we were extremely frustrated that we had caught absolutely none of the Tweezer beaked hopping rats. We knew that they, well, at least they had been there. We weren't catching them. The next to the last day before we were due to leave, one of the guys was out setting live traps, cage traps, and saw a burrow going into the side of a little hill, and took the trap and shoved it up against the entrance to the burrow so that the animal inside couldn't get out without going into the trap. When he came back the next morning, there was one of these. Cool animal, very docile, friendly, very curious about us, didn't, you know, not aggressive at all. Brought it back to camp, and put it on a little table, and we did feeding trials, which we typically do with these animals about which we know almost nothing. And just, you know, try feeding it different kinds of things. So we tried some beetles. No. We tried some fruit from the forest. No. We tried mushrooms. No. We tried cooked rice. No. We tried dried mangoes. No. Everything that we could think of, we would hold out for this little guy. He would hop across the cage and kind of sniff at it and, you know, anthropomorphizing. He looked disappointed. And he would hop back over to his little nest without eating anything. By the next morning, he clearly was getting hungry. Well, at that point, one of the guys kicked over a rock that was next to the table that he was on and saw an earthworm underneath it. Picked up the earthworm and held it out. The rat leapt across the cage, grabbed it out of his hand, shucked all the dirt out, and swallowed it like a long stick of spaghetti. These animals are primary vermivores. They feed on very little other than earthworms, which are extremely abundant in this habitat. And I'll show you a photograph of that in a moment. These are animals that are specialized in feeding on an unusual but abundant source of food in that tropical forest environment. So we immediately ran out, dug up a whole bunch of earthworms and baited our traps with live squirming earthworms and discovered that there were lots of species on that mountain that we had not seen before. So development of new, well, I guess you can call it new technology of a sort, can play a huge impact, a huge role on what you can learn about these animals. One of the things we've learned is that simply figuring out how to catch these animals is a major part of the research. It involves a skill set that is often underappreciated, but it's extremely important. And yes, that earthworm in the upper right-hand corner really is iridescent blue. There are iridescent green ones. We've seen bright red ones, lots of different colors and lots of different sizes. Okay, so as evolutionary biologists, we think about the animals or plants, whatever, organisms, as being part of the tree of life. These diagrams show the tree of life for the cloud rats up here and the earthworm mice down here. So remember, 93% of the 56 species of native small mammals on Luzon, or native non-flying mammals, occur nowhere else. So how did they get there? There are a lot, I mean, that's a lot of species, 52 species. How, these are oceanic islands. They've never been connected to the Asian mainland. So they had to float on a log or something of the sort to get out there. So how many times have those clearly very rare events taken place, and what's happened afterwards? Well, we're able to use DNA data for rats and mice as a whole to correlate the relationships that we see among the living species with fossil species that have been dated. That allows us to work out the approximate timing of the diversification and a variety of events within each one of these branches of the tree of life. So with the cloud rats, we estimate that their common ancestor arrived in the Philippines from the Asian mainland sometime between 12 and 14 million years ago. By approximately 10 million years ago, and these gray bars show our, that's the confidence interval. That's the estimate of the possible range. So somewhere between 12 and 8 million years ago, the first speciation event took place in this group of cloud rats. That gave rise, on the one hand, to this group of giant cloud rats, and the other to all of the other ones that subsequently diversified. So beginning with an arrival sometime around 12 to 14 million years ago, over time, that has gradually produced the 18 species that are present today. So the evolution of approximately 1.4 species per million years is the rate at which new species have been produced. So we're talking about evolution and diversification taking place on the time scale of hundreds of thousands and millions of years. For the earthworm mice, which are even more diverse, 56 that are known in the Philippines overall at this time, we estimate that they arrived in the Philippines somewhere between 7 and 8 million years ago, gradually giving rise to the 5 genera that we know of today in the 56 species. Some of them haven't diversified very much. Archboldamines, only 2 species. Rincomines, the tweezer beaked guys, only 5 species. But some of them, like this Apamines down here, we know of about 20 on Luzon and at least 15 elsewhere in the Philippines. We're still working on trying to figure out just exactly how many species there are. So the vast majority, we estimate that among the native non-flying mammals that are on Luzon Island, which is now well known, and I'll talk more about that, of the 52 species that are endemic, about 85% are the result of just these 2 successful, rare colonization events. Floating on a log out to an oceanic island is obviously something that's quite rare even for a group of islands like the Philippines that are relatively close to other land areas, it's still a very rare event. And yet when it happens, the impact is profound. So what did things look like roughly 10 million years ago when this was happening? Well, here's a map by geologists who love to deal with this kind of thing, showing here the Asian mainland up here. The Vietnam is along the coast here. There's the Malay Peninsula. What's going to become the modern island of Borneo here with a mountain area that had developed by 10 million years ago. Here are the islands of the Philippines out here, pretty isolated and quite a bit smaller than they are today. So 10 million years ago, the likelihood of catching a ride on a log from Borneo or from Vietnam or southern China, that was pretty unlikely. So how did that happen? Well, we could talk more about that later on, but right now it looks as though most of this probably took place as very rare events during typhoons going through. So when typhoons pass by, and there are a lot of them that go through this part of the world, there are strong winds that, as the typhoon moves through, are blowing in, well, all 360 degrees around the eye of the typhoon. And so they can very quickly move a mat of vegetation or a floating log across a lot of seawater. So right now, that's the best guess that we have. We know that there were not dry land connections going out there. That much is clear. The only viable option left then is that they floated out there. Okay, so another aspect that we've learned is very, very important. Has to do with one of the things that many of us, including me, were taught in school, which is that maximum biological diversity occurs in lowland tropical rainforest. Period, end of sentence. Well, okay, so one of the things that we became aware of with the work in the Philippines very early is that there's a lot of environmental variation along the elevational gradient from sea level going up to the top of the highest mountains. The highest mountains in the Philippines are about 3,000 meters tall, so that's about 10,000 feet, a little short of that. So not terribly tall mountains, but there are a lot of them. Okay, so as you go from sea level, where it is hot and pretty wet, typically about 2 meters of rain per year, and typical daily highs in the very upper 80s, low 90s is very, very common. As you go up in elevation in the Philippines and anywhere else, temperature declines in a very regular way. So, if you're out in the southwestern US and you're in the desert and you look up the top of the mountain, it's green up there and it's cool, it's wet. That is typical everywhere around the world. Temperature declines as you go up in elevation. And as temperature declines, the ability of the air to hold moisture in a gaseous state, it declines. In other words, as you go up in elevation, you tend to have condensation take place. If there's enough condensation, then you get rain. So rainfall in the Philippines at sea level is, it averages at about 2 meters, so a little over 6 feet. Up high in the mountains, it's typically 3 to 4 meters. There are places where it will hit 5 meters per year. That's about 18 feet of rain on average per year. And there are some years where some places can get 8 meters of rain in a given year. This is really wet habitat up high. This is a picture of what that habitat looks like. So it's really cool up there. It's quite cool. Never freezes, but it's cool. And it's very, very wet. So you can see there are orchids growing all over the place, bird's nest ferns, there's moss growing everywhere. This is one of the names commonly used for this kind of habitat is Mossy Forest. You can see why. If you were to walk out into that clearing and pour out a 55-gallon drum of water, none of it would run off the surface. It absorbs down into the soil. It's so cool and so cloudy and wet up there that there are no ants, there are no termites. There are instead What breaks down the dead plant material are fungi, mushrooms, and earthworms, and a few other kinds of invertebrates. So these layers of partially decomposed vegetation build up on the surface, and you can get anywhere from a foot to 6 or 8 feet thick layer of partially decomposed vegetation. The earthworms love it. That's why there are so many earthworm specialist mice living in this area. It's fabulous habitat. I absolutely love it. Really wet. Okay, so back to my comment about maximum diversity in lowland tropical rainforest. So here's bats. This is an example from one family of bats. These are called horseshoe-faced bats. You can see that most of them occur, this is just a list of species on Luzon Island. Most of the species occur below 1,000 meters, so about 3,000 feet. A few of them get up to 1,500 meters, but basically once you get above about 3,000 feet, there are very few of these bats around. Same thing is true for all the rest of the bats. It's true for a lot of other kinds of organisms as well. If we look at these small mammals, though, which mostly are things that you might be inclined to think of as a mouse of some kind, there are very, very few below 1,000 meters. There are some, and some of them are pretty common, but really it's not until above 1,000 meters and pretty close to 1,500 meters that you begin to pick up much diversity. And as you go up above that, the number of species and the density of individuals increases really dramatically until you get up quite high on the mountain. So maximum biological diversity is in lowland tropical rainforest for only about roughly half of the kinds of organisms that we work with. We know that now that for a large number of organisms, as you go up in elevation, diversity increases. And that's true for the very abundant, very diverse small mammals globally, anywhere around the world. Nevada, you go up to higher elevations and there is more diversity up there than there is in the lowlands. Same thing in the tropics. So, whoops, sorry. Okay, so what does that have to do with our research program? Well, all right, so in the year 2000, we had realized that diversity increased as we went up in elevation along the few transects that we had done at that point. So we mapped out where high elevation species occurred, particularly endemic species, those that occurred only in very limited areas on Luzon Island. So here's Manila Bay down here. The city of Manila is in this area. The big mountain chain up north, we knew of 10 species that occurred only in that area. That's a lot. 2 species that occurred only over here, only 1 over here, 3 on this one mountain down here where we caught the Tweezer beaked hopping rat. None on this mountain, which is about the same height as this one. None here, none here, none here. Why only 1 here and 2 here? What's, why there are 3 down here? Why are there so few over here? Well, when we looked at the data, it immediately became obvious. It's because no one had looked. Literally, no one had gone to these other areas, and it meant most of these areas, there had never been consistently done surveys of even the mammals. So beginning in the year 2000, we began doing that. Here's a map that shows our areas of intensive surveys, the elevational transects. This involved 40 team months, so a tremendous amount of effort, sampling along elevational transects all over Luzon Island. What we found was that when we started, the number of species of mammals known of non-flying native species on Luzon was 28. In 12 years, we caught 28 previously unknown species of mammals. We doubled the number of species on the island, which was already the best known island in the Philippines. to give you some example, and so that you don't think of these things as, well, they're all mice, they all look alike. Well, some of them kind of look like mice. Some of them really don't look very much like mice. These are ecologically and morphologically really diverse animals. Here's that little micro dwarf giant cloud rat. That's my hand for scale. I can maybe have time to talk more about this later on. So one of the primary things that we learned from this is that mammals on tropical islands globally are still remarkably poorly known. In many areas, we know of less than half of the species that are actually there. So starting in 2000, there's what the picture looked like. We knew of 28 species. By 2011, 2012, we were up to 56 species. And you can see that even in this relatively well-known mountain range up north, the number had gone up to 14. Here we went from 2 to 7, from 1 to 6, down here from 3 to 6, 4 native, and these are endemic mammals. So each one of these numbers refers to the number of species that occur nowhere else in the world, just within the area circled in red. So bear in mind, as I mentioned earlier, there are no countries in continental Europe that have more than 4 native species of endemic mammals. No country in continental Europe. So Luzon is an island, but it is an island of effectively sky islands, isolated areas of this very distinctive mossy forest habitat at high elevation, where there are lots of individuals and lots of species that are isolated from other areas of similar habitat and that have evolved into separate species. Okay, so Luzon overall then, well, it's a big island. It's about 103,000 square kilometers. That is, Corey and Nathan and I were talking before we got started, that is twice the size of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So there's your scaling point. It has been a continuously dry land oceanic island, in part, for 27 million years. So it's one of the oldest oceanic islands that we know of. The oldest of the islands in Hawaii is 5 million years old. So this is vastly older than that. The island itself has the world's second greatest concentration of endemic mammals, of unique species. The other island that's the competitor is Sulawesi, that island in Indonesia that is also an oceanic island immediately to the south of the Philippines. The Philippines as a whole has the greatest concentration of any country. Well, okay, so that's the good news. It's a really fabulous fauna, just a wonderful, wonderful place to study anything having to do with biodiversity, biogeography, ecology, community ecology, any of those kinds of things. It's really a wonderful fauna. That's the good news. Many of you are probably well aware that the Philippines has had a lot of problems over the years. The single biggest, well, many problems. It's a tropical country. It has been very, very heavily deforested. Logging, commercial logging began in the early 1900s and to some degree even before that. The result of that is that the old growth forest, tropical forest in the Philippines, is now down to about 6% of what was there originally. The population of the Philippines as a whole is about 110 million. And that's in an area that is, let's see, about 10 times the size of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The Manila area alone has about 23 million people. this logging and clearing for agriculture that has been done often has been extremely poorly managed. The result is massive levels of erosion and, of course, severe flooding. The photo on the bottom there was taken in the city of Ormoc about a month after we were doing field work there. There was a flash flood from a typhoon that passed through. 7,000 people died in about 20 minutes. The environmental challenges are huge. Well, okay, so what do biologists do to try to respond to something like this? So I'm going to run through quickly a few of the things that the project that I've been involved with have done. One is that when we discover all of these new species, we can publish the results in peer-reviewed journals. We make that information available through press releases to outlets in the Philippines. What we have learned is that people absolutely love this. Finding out that they've got something that foreigners get excited about, that lives in their backyard, in effect, has a very, very positive impact. People love it. We have prepared field guides to initially the mammals of individual national parks and other areas. This little field guide on the bottom right-hand corner is an example. There was nothing like this available previously. I mean, we're accustomed to being able to go into a bookstore and pick up a field guide to the mammals or a field guide to the amphibians or whatever we're interested in. There's virtually none of that in the Philippines except for birds, or there was in the past. The book in the center is a combination of things. It is a field guide to the mammals of Luzon Island. It is also a book about the biogeography, the ecology and evolution of the Philippine fauna as a whole. We wrote that specifically to serve as a textbook for university students. It's had a really wonderful impact. Lots of this information we also put online. There are various things that are fully available. Another outcome has been that, you hear all sorts of horror stories about people trying to work with governments and not having a positive response. When we have gone to the Philippine government and said, look, we just finished doing this field work on this mountain in this place that has no protected status at all right now, and we just found 2 previously unknown species of mammals that live nowhere else in the world, or 3 or 5 that occur nowhere else in the world. You might want to think about having this declared as a national park. The response has been, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. So these are complex matters. We certainly can't claim credit for having created new national parks. It doesn't work that way. It's always more complex. But what we found is that often this serves as a spark and a focal point that allows attention to be placed on these areas. And the result of that is that about 24 places where we had documented previously unknown species of mammals, parks either have been or in the process of being officially designated. It's been one of the most positive aspects of the outcome of our work. Another thing that we've done, so when I started working in the Philippines in 1981, it was getting toward the end of the Marcos dictatorship era. The economy was a wreck. Things were really bad. There were almost no biologists left in the Philippines. Those who could leave had left, working in other countries. But things began to get somewhat better. By 1990, it was clear that the possibility was there for improving things. I was very fortunate to get a grant from the MacArthur Foundation to start a program of training young Philippine biologists in the field in the Philippines, and bringing people to the Field Museum, to Chicago more broadly, the museum and the zoos here, and the universities, to get intensive training that helped them do their work. Now, these were all young professionals, so they were either faculty or working for NGOs or for government agencies of one sort or another. We were able to get some of them to Washington, D.C. so that they can meet people at the World Resources Institute and World Wildlife Fund and other organizations of that sort. That has had a huge impact as well. One of the best aspects of this was the founding of what we initially called the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines in 1992, when we pulled together all of the people we could find who worked on birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians in the Philippines from a biodiversity and conservation perspective. We could find 27 people in the country with the highest concentration of unique biological diversity in the world. 27 people total. Well, the group decided to form the Wildlife Conservation Society of the Philippines. We subsequently renamed that as the Biodiversity Conservation Society of the Philippines. Roughly 10 years later, we were getting typically 200 to 300 attendees. We now have over 1,000 members of the society. We've been very, very actively involved. The society has been very, very actively involved in compiling information on endangered species, publishing a red data book for the Philippines, and working with government agencies on national planning activities for conservation at a national level. One of the things that I think, and I'm close to getting to the end here, is that that has made a huge difference is that as the economy of the Philippines in the late 1980s and into the 1990s headed downhill, continued to slide downhill. The environmental conditions were terrible, economic conditions were terrible. Possibility of environmental collapse seemed to be very real, political collapse. What happened was that people voted with their feet. Tremendous number of people left the country and began sending money home to their families. These mostly are people who come from relatively low income families, some very low. They send money home, and you can gauge the impact of this by looking for Western Union signs as you go through the little towns all over the Philippines. The single largest source of GDP in the Philippines now is the remittances that are sent home by Filipinos working overseas. That has had a huge impact on improving the economy. It means that people have been able to move down out of the mountains into more urbanized areas. Some leave the country to look for work elsewhere. And the result is that the amount of second growth tropical forest in the Philippines is now increasing substantially. So there is now probably somewhere between 2 and 3 times as much good second growth as there is old growth. And we've learned that as that second growth regenerates, the native mammals and birds move back in. So, okay, when things look bad, it actually may not be as bad as you thought. That's one of the major things that I personally have learned from this. People get excited about this kind of stuff. They love it. It's, having, and particularly something that relates to them personally and directly, really makes a difference. We've also been really pleased to see that solid scientific information that comes from published information in peer-reviewed journals is highly respected. It really makes a difference to government agencies, to conservation organizations, and so on. And the final thing that I want to mention is that I've come to believe that one of the most important things for people who want to do this kind of work in general is that it's extremely important to make a long-term commitment, to stick with projects. Don't do things on a 2 or 3 year basis and then pick up and leave. You really need to be part of a community if you're going to have a significant impact. It also makes it just a great deal more personally rewarding and fun. So with that, I will stop. I don't know, Corey, if there's time to take any questions at this point.
I go through the motions here of unmuting and turning the camera on. Yeah, we actually do have a few questions. Candace is curious about, with all the endemic bat species, has white nose syndrome or another similar issue surfaced that has threatened those endemic populations, endemic species?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So right now, so far as anybody knows, the answer is no to white nose. Fortunately not. The biggest threat to bat populations right now at this moment is overhunting. Both the big bats that are big enough to catch and eat are actively caught and eaten. And the little ones that live in caves, people will go in, the very, very, very low income, impoverished local people will go in, and often they set fires in the cave to create smoke and asphyxiate bats, pick up the dead ones off the floor and cook them up. So it's a very, very direct sort of thing. So far as we can tell, that's declining significantly as the economy improves.
What about dominant predators on the island? Another question coming in from the audience.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting business. So in the oceanic Philippines, there are hawks and owls, not a lot, but they're around. Lots of snakes that are predatory in the lowlands, but snakes don't do well in areas that are cool and wet. And so the high elevation habitats where there's an awful lot of the mammal diversity, there are essentially no snakes around at all. In the oceanic portions of the Philippines, there are no native mammalian carnivores. None. They're not there. There are two species of civets, which are little carnivores that that whole group doesn't occur in North America. They're kind of little raccoon or cat-like animals. There are two of those that have been introduced widely in the Philippines, starting, we think, about 3,000 years ago. And they certainly do have some impact, but it doesn't seem as though, even though they're naturalized, they're in the forest, we don't yet see evidence that they're having an overwhelming impact by any means. So it's those high elevation mossy forest areas where these small mammals are so abundant are remarkably low predation, to the point of almost being predation free, which is really unusual. Very interesting. Something that really deserves a lot more attention, a lot more research. Corey, are you there?
Sorry there, I thought I was unmuted, but I was not. Linda asks, how many of those earthworms are endemic species, and is anyone doing invertebrate diversity research?
Yeah, so after our discovery of earthworms as a primary food source in 1988 on that one mountain, we caught a whole bunch of earthworms, started at the bottom of the mountain and did sampling up to the top and pickled a whole bunch of earthworms and sent them off to one of the two people in the United States who was at the time a specialist on earthworm taxonomy. And took him about 1.5 years to write back. And he said, well, you got 18 species and they're all undescribed. They're all new. So at that point, we were working down on Mindanao. So, and again, baiting traps with earthworms. We caught a whole bunch of earthworms and pickled them and sent them off to this guy, Sam. And about 1.5 years later, Sam wrote back and said, okay, this time you got 28 species. And they're all new, and there's no overlap with the ones that you got the last time. So I'm sending in a proposal to the National Science Foundation to go study earthworms in the Philippines. So at this point, we don't know how many species of earthworms are there. No clue.
Yeah, and that's the amazing thing. I think that, for often the charismatic megafauna, you have multiple biologists studying a single species, but then when it comes to the invertebrates or maybe the lesser known ones, you can have several hundred species of insects or invertebrates to every one biologist.
Well, that is generally true, but I would say that in a lot of the tropics, and particularly the Asian tropics, are arguably the least well-known part of the world in terms of biodiversity overall. South America is much better known. Africa is not very well known. The Asian tropics are the worst. In a lot of places, there are, even with mammals, there are very few people actively studying them. And the ratio of mammalogists to mammal species is, oh man, certainly the mammals are outnumbering the scientists by at least 10 to 1 and probably 20 to 1.
So we know that humans have had a profound impact on species diversity, particularly in island systems. And as I understand, there are several interesting fossils recovered from the islands. What do we know about these mammals, and was their fate inherently tied to human occupancy on the islands?
Yeah, so great question. I'll try to answer briefly. So up until recently, the only information that we had about fossil mammals in the Philippines came from some surface finds. So, somebody would find a tooth somewhere and, it would make its way to a museum or university. And from that, we knew that at some point during the ice ages, unknown timing, there were rhinoceros in the Philippines. There were widespread native dwarf water buffaloes. There were 2 different kinds of elephants, the Asian elephant, closely related to it, and then an extinct group of elephants called stegodons that were all out there. And then some pigs, extinct species of pigs as well. So that began to change rather abruptly and dramatically just a few years ago when you may remember, so in Indonesia, about 12, 15 years ago, something like that, these dwarf humans from the islands of Flores were announced, the ones that are often referred to now as hobbits. That species is only known from that one island down in Indonesia. Well, about 2 years ago now, maybe a little more than that, a new species of humans was described from the Philippines. 65,000 years old, or is the age of the fossils. They also are very small people, maybe 4 feet tall. The fossil material that's available so far is so fragmentary that it's not clear what they're related to. Not very closely related to us, probably closer to the species that's often referred to as Homo erectus, or Peking man, or Java man, that group, but dwarfed versions of that. Then about a year ago, a paper was published describing a fossil rhinoceros skeleton that was found in place, excavated in place, still in the sediments. And it's very clear that that rhinoceros had been butchered. People had cut it up. You can see the cut marks. You can see the places where rocks were used to smash the bones to get at the marrow. That fossil has been firmly dated at 700,000 years old. There were people of some kind living, and there were stone tools there. There were people of some kind living on Luzon Island 700,000 years ago. So there was a substantial, a large mammal fauna of some kind, including people, that have been there for a lot longer than we've been thinking. In addition to that, I'm now working with someone who just finished up her PhD. She's now on the faculty at the University of the Philippines, describing 3 new species of fossil extinct giant cloud rats. These came from the same cave on Luzon where the 65,000-year-old dwarf humans were described from. These giant cloud rats, we've got enough information to know that they persisted from about 65,000 years ago up until about 3,000 years ago when they rather abruptly disappeared. That is the same time when there was a major cultural change in the Philippines. People began doing large-scale rice agriculture. That's when water buffaloes were brought in and domestic dogs. And when monkeys and the two little carnivore species were brought in, when domestic pigs were brought in, lots of changes taking place. So we don't know whether humans were directly involved in the extinction of any of these species. But with these cloud rats, it seems most likely that some anthropogenic factor was associated with their extinction about 3,000 years ago.
So two more questions for you here, if we have time. The first is, you mentioned that potentially here in the Philippines, we have the oldest oceanic island at 27 million years old. When you compare that to something like Hawaii, that's 5 million years old at the oldest island, and we see the introduction of invasive species causing diversity collapse of native species there, what is it about these islands in the Philippines that has allowed the endemic species to persist in the wake of movement of people, of resources, of wildlife? How has that stronghold been able to hang on? Do these endemic species have such a unique niche, or is it that they've just not been colonized yet by these invasives?
Right, right. So one of the real surprises of our work has come from our surveys that we conduct along disturbance gradients. So I've mentioned the elevational gradients, where we start at the bottom of the mountain and work our way to the top. Well, in other places, we start in old growth forest and do sampling all the way out into 100% agricultural areas. So when we do that kind of sampling on Luzon and some of the other islands, what we see is that in the habitat that looks, well, either old growth, undisturbed, or good quality regenerating forest, or even secondary forest, there are no exotic pest rats present. There are lots of the native species, but the pest rats that have been brought in the last couple thousand years that are so widespread on lots of islands elsewhere are absent. As we go progressively further and further into the more disturbed anthropogenic type habitats, we begin to pick up some of those pest rats. But it's really not until we get into areas that are principally agricultural that they're at all abundant. And in fact, what we see is that some of the native species actually occur out into the agricultural areas, where, for example, one of them, it's one of the ones that feeds on earthworms. One of the big agricultural problems in the Philippines is that there are these gigantic earthworms that burrow through the walls of the rice terraces and poke holes in them so that the water comes out and you get erosion, and you don't want that going on in your rice terrace. Well, these mice feed on those earthworms. So it's actually a positive thing to have these native mice occurring in the agricultural areas. So what we're seeing, and talking to colleagues who work elsewhere on the big islands in Southeast Asia, is that every place where there is a natural community of small mammals that's present, the exotic pest species get nowhere invading into the natural habitats. The native species are competitively superior by anybody's measure to the exotic pest species in anything that looks even vaguely like natural habitat. Yeah, so that's, it's not the story that we're accustomed to hearing about, and it's another one of the very positive things that's great to see.
Last question for you here. How has working at a natural history museum influenced the questions you ask, as well as the understanding of the systems you study?
Yeah, Yeah. So I mean, natural history museums are really unique in that typically they have two functions. One is to serve as a place for, you know, educating the public and increasing the enjoyment that we take in the natural world. That's a big part of the Draper Museum. Clearly it is at the Field Museum as well. But natural history museums also very frequently have a significant research component. So there's almost a research institute within the museum. And the research institutes typically are collection-based. So we have specimens that accumulate over time that come from, you know, various different geographic areas that allow us to address questions that people can't deal with otherwise. So we can look at the effects of climate change, for example, in a very direct way by looking at the specimens of mammals that were collected in a given place 100 years ago, and 50 years ago, and 25 years ago, to see what kinds of changes have taken place. Because now, these days, with current technology, for example, we can get a pretty good idea of predominantly what they were eating at each of these different times. We can look at the genetics of the animals that occur in these areas. An example of that is that, oh geez, it's probably 15 years ago now, but you know, grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone area went through a pretty severe bottleneck. And there was a lot of concern that there might have been a great loss of genetic diversity and potential for inbreeding depression. Well, the way that you can address that is to go to museums and collect DNA samples from grizzlies that were collected in the 1920s. We've got 8 of them at the Field Museum, and compare genetic diversity in that population from 1920s to what's there today. There is no other way you can answer that question, which is critically important to the future of the species. And that's just one example of the kind of research that can be done. Obviously, the work that I do that involves trying to figure out how many species are present is utterly dependent on being able to compare specimens of these animals to, you know, do a variety of different kinds of analyses to determine how many distinct kinds of organisms we're working with. That much of that can only be done working with specimens that are kept in a museum collection.
Very well said. Dr. Haney, thank you for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to visit with us, share your wealth of knowledge and experience. You know, we hope to, again, soon host live audiences, and we would love to have you in person as well. A big thank you again to our sponsors for supporting the Lunchtime Expedition Lectures, the speaker series. We're going to upload the presentation to YouTube. So if there's anything you missed or that you would like to hear again and revisit that Larry discussed, you'll be able to find it there. Thank you all for tuning in. And Dr. Haney, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. We wish you all the best of luck with all of your current and future endeavors.
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure.